I had a most unusual Christmas card this year from Madrid. It was one of my friends who made his own Christmas card. And he was on the front looking very happy, and his wife Nydia was behind him. And the whole card was full of life, and it was such an unusual card. I thought, well, I'm going to have a go at making my own cards this year again. So I thought what I'd do, I had this crazy idea that I wanted to have all the hands of the members of our family spread out in a circle, all stretching outward. And I thought if I photographed this, if I could get somebody to do it, it would make a very unusual Christmas card. And so I'm just going to show it to you now. It looked like this. You see, all the hands are facing outwards, and at the top there are my hands, and then there are my wife Doreen's, and then Rupert's, my son, and then Lulu, and then on the other side are my wife's mother. And you can see all the ages of mankind there, from age to youth. And I thought it would make a very interesting card. And it looks like anything you like to mention, really. It looks like a star, perhaps, if you think about it. Somebody said rather, I thought rather insultingly, it looks like a cow with about 50 udders. But, you know, it's quite an interesting sort of experiment for a Christmas card. But the getting of that together was an absolutely colossal project. First of all, I had to get the photographer to agree to do it. And he photographed our hands separately and then put them together on a composite photograph. And then he had to scale it all down and handed me back the end product. And then I had to get it photoed at the library. And then I had to come back and make a wax stencil of it. And then I had to do the typing of the words peace and goodwill to all mankind. And I thought the obvious thing to write on it was, Christ has no hands on earth but your hands to do his work. That seemed to make a good Christmas message. And then there was the stencil for the other side of it with all the parish information about Christmas this year on it. And when all that was done, then I had to run it off and duplicate it and hope it came out. And when by the time you've done about 5,000 of those, you're terribly anxious in case it doesn't work once you've committed yourself. However, it did work and it came out quite well. And it was worth all the effort and time that I put into it. But you see, the funny thing about it is that many people have said, well, what is it? You know, they've seen all these hands and think, oh yes, it's a photograph, or, you know, of people's hands. What they don't realize is that it's our family's hands and the ages of mankind. And when they see the text, Christ has no hands but your hands to do his work on earth, they begin to see the point that it's peace on earth, which is the message of Christmas. And I suppose when you think about it, that Jesus, when he came onto this earth, he came and people didn't really understand what he was doing there, and they missed the point too. One or two of them asked what was it all about, and then eventually they learned. And God, I'm sure, felt that Christmas was all worth it in coming into this world to proclaim peace. And I believe it's all well worth it. And I hope that you share this with me, that you believe that it was all well worth it as well. Well, now, I hope you've had a very happy Christmas, and I wish you every blessing. Good night. God bless you. Hello again. Firstly, a very dear friend of mine, and indeed of yours, died yesterday, and you'll remember him, the Reverend Prebendary Charles de Serja. He was one of the original Faith for Life team here 20 years ago, and when I first came to Plymouth, he was like a second father to me, and I shall certainly miss him, and I'm sure you will too. And I'd just like to express in these few words my gratitude to him for everything that he did for me. But today has been Ash Wednesday, and I thought this is a very appropriate day to tell you about the most extraordinary 12 hours of my life. It all happened one Friday night on the 18th of September last year, and I was fed up with work, and I packed up about 9 o'clock, and I thought, well, I'm going to turn the doorbell off. I couldn't care less who calls at the door. I'm going to pull the phone out, and I'm just going to get a bottle of homemade plonk out, and we're going to sit down and enjoy the rest of the evening. And so I'd had about half the glass, and there was an awful banging at the door, and Doreen said, oh, forget it, you know, we're day off now, something like that. And the noise was so terrible, I said, no, I've got to answer the door. And I went there, and there was terrific banging and a shouting, and I opened the door, and there was a young lad who said, the church is on fire. Now, this is the thing that I've always dreaded. It's absolutely awful. And what happened happened in the next 12 hours or so, I could hardly tell you, but I know that I dialed 999, and doesn't it take an infinity somehow to get through? Of course, it's very quick, but it seems to take so long. Then I went tearing over to the church, and remembered to take the key with me. And I got the ladder out of the vestry and shut the doors again, you know, all the fire drill, and took the ladders up to the east end outside and climbed up them, and I could see where I thought the fire was, and this terrific explosion that nearly blew me off the ladder, so I thought I'd leave that to somebody else. Then rushing back in again the church, shut the doors, and of course the place was in darkness, and the fire was licking away by that time. I was terrified. And I knew where the fire extinguishers were. Anybody watching here, please note. And I got the first extinguisher, and I thought the best thing to do would be to just see where the fire was coming through the ceiling, and as the bits fell down, so I would spray them out. And then I thought better of this. I thought, well, if I spray the area of the altar and the choir stalls with the fire extinguisher, at least when the stuff does drop down there, it's not so likely to catch alight if it's wet. And so this is how it went, and it seemed to be an infinity, and I ran out of the first fire extinguisher, got the next one, the place is full of smoke, and that one ran out, and I was just about at the end of my tether, because I knew there's only one more fire extinguisher left, apart from the one for the electrics, and somebody shouted, "Anybody inside?" And I said, "Yes, what kept you?" You know, you always panic like this, don't you, in times of crisis. And he said, "Well, if I were you, I'd leave now, sir." So I went outside, and by that stage the fire engine was screaming around, and smoke and fire crackling, and it seemed an absolute infinity, you know, before anything happened, and yet it wasn't. It was all very quick. And I give the fire brigade credit where it's due. They let the fire burn out, and I couldn't understand this really, because I thought the thing to do was put the fire out, but more damage would have been caused by water than by the flames which are going upwards, which is a good thing. But it really was absolutely terrifying, and people were milling around, and there must have been hundreds of parishioners getting all the valuable things out of the church and stuffing them in the vicarage and all safe places. And it really was a most extraordinary moment in my life. And I was there sort of with the chief fire officer, and I said, "What's the best thing I can do?" He said, "Well, you can sort of stay here and be a focal point for people who want to know what's going on." And when I thought I'd had enough later on that night, I said to him, "Well, what do I do now?" And he said, "Well, if I were you, I'd go home and have a good brandy." I thought it was a good idea for a start. He said, "Then I'd go to sleep." And so I did. I went home and shut the door and had a brandy and went to sleep. And you know, one of the most extraordinary things about that whole incident was that I could just do this. I thought, if Montgomery can sleep through Alamein, so can I. And this is the thing I feared most, that the church would burn down. And I thought you might be rather interested to know exactly what it looked like, first of all from the outside. This is looking down from the tower. And then a little later on, when the workmen had come in to sort of put tarpaulins all over the place, this is what it looked like from the inside, because more damage was caused by rain than was caused by any of the firemen's hoses. Incredible sight, wasn't it? And you know, thinking about this that night as I was going to sleep, it suddenly came to me that God was saying something in all this. He's saying that the church consists of flesh and blood, of people, rather than just buildings. And you know, that hit me for six, but I'm sure it's absolutely right. Well, I'm going to tell you a bit more about this saga tomorrow night if you're watching in. Anyway, for the moment, good night, and God bless you. Wednesday, and I thought it was an appropriate time to talk about the fire which destroyed 2/3 of our church roof. And if you weren't able to watch last night, this was September last year I'm talking about, perhaps you'd like to see a couple of slides of how it looked shortly after the fire. First of all, from the outside. It's a terrible mess, isn't it? And this is what it looked like on the inside when the workmen had put the tarpaulins down to stop the rain. We had torrential rain that day, and it brought down much of the plaster and so on. It was nothing that the firemen did, but that was just rain damage. And so that's the situation with the church. And I thought tonight, just for a few moments, we'd have a look and see about some of the history of the church and some of the fascinating things that's happened here at Tamerton Foliot, which is northwest Plymouth. And the first thing I found of interest was that in 689 there was a Celtic saint called St. Indracht, who apparently founded the church, or a church, in Tamerton. And the possibility is that that church was called after Indracht, or St. Indracht, until 1318, when the church was rededicated and it was called St. Mary's Church. And it's really quite exciting when you think about it, because in about 7 years' time, it'll be 1300 years since St. Indracht came to Tamerton. And I reckon that's something worthy of a celebration. In fact, we might even change the name of the church, or at least add St. Indracht and restore it where it was originally, and call it St. Mary with St. Indracht, to make the point. 1300 years is quite some achievement. Well, there are all sorts of things that I've discovered from the history of the church. The first vicar was somebody called Sir Richard Le Dennis, who came in 1279. And although the notice board inside the church, it still remains actually in the south aisle, it wasn't destroyed by the fire, says that the first vicar was 1283. There was actually one in 1279, and I wonder what he'd have made of, say, PostScript in 1982, whether he'd understand what television was all about. And I wonder whether he'd think me a worthy successor. I'm the 49th vicar of this church, and I'm afraid that I feel particularly humble about being vicar, having allowed the fire to destroy the church that so many people had sought to keep in such beautiful order all these years and these centuries. And as I said, it was rededicated in 1318. But looking through the book, it was quite interesting to see what sorts of things happened. That in 1552, there was an obligation on everybody to actually attend church, and if they didn't, they were fined. It's quite, imagine sort of saying today to people that if they didn't come to church, they'd be fined unless they had a lawful or reasonable excuse to be absent. That'd shake a few of you. And looking back a little further, in 1878, I found something rather interesting, that there was a deanery of Tamerton which had existed from the Middle Ages right until then. And it's only about just over 100 years ago that the Tamerton deanery was abolished, which is quite exciting, really, isn't it? And even more sort of domestic, there's a bathroom added to the vicarage in 1910, which cost £128. Now, that's certain it's the same one that we have in our house at the moment. And our house, looking at this book again, was actually rebuilt about 1775, the same year, in fact, when the new stocks were bought for the parish, and they were stuck in the church porch. They are there now. And just imagine, only 1775, and people were still using stocks to punish offenders in. And looking a little further on here, of course, we opened and built the church hall in 1974, and reslated this very same church roof at a cost of £7,000 in 1977. That's only just 4 or 5 years ago, and now it's all burnt down. Well, it's not really funny, it's a deadly serious thing, but I think God told us in this incident that people matter more than buildings. Well, you can read all this and much more in this history which I've been referring to, and tonight I've given you just a glimpse of our church's past. And if you look in next Monday, I'm going to talk about the church as it is at the present, and some of the things that we have to do at the moment with no church building to worship in. Well, until then, good night, and God bless you. Do you feel like if you were the vicar of a parish and you woke up one morning to find your blessed church had burnt down? I mean, take a look at this here. You see, I feel a bit sick really to think I was responsible for all this, because I was the vicar of the parish when it all happened, and all these guys over the centuries had looked after the church very carefully and preserved it intact. And so we're now right in the process of putting it right after the fire last September, and I thought you might just like to see what it looked like a few weeks ago. This is from the inside. And just to think that it was only 5 years ago that we completely re-roofed the church, and that's the very same roof that's just burnt down. It makes you sick, doesn't it, really? However, people are constantly asking me how we're managing at the present moment with the church in a state of repair like this. Well, fortunately, the fire didn't really touch the south aisle, and so we're able to use the south aisle for weddings, providing that nobody has more than about 100 guests at the weddings. And we're also able to use it for funerals and for baptisms. And this is all very encouraging and helpful. And everything else takes place in the church hall, which is next door. And how lucky that was, because we only built that 8 years ago, and what would we have done without it? And in fact, having to worship in the church hall next door has had some remarkable side effects. Firstly, that everybody has to sit together. Now, this is a great social revolution, because in the previous building, in the church itself, people were quite happy to sit about 25 yards apart and never speak to each other, never even recognize each other. But now they have to sit together and say hello, which is a good thing, isn't it? Because the church is all about fellowship. And secondly, the hall gets so packed out from time to time that we don't need to have the heating on, so this must save fuel, and that's a good thing too. And thirdly, one of the things I like particularly is that we've been able to experiment a little with the placing of the altar, and we've brought it a little more into the congregation, into the body of the church hall, so that people sit all round it as if they're round the Lord's table, which I think is superb theology anyway. So I thought you might like to know about those things, but it isn't all sweetness, joy and light, because meeting in church hall for worship has had its problems too. I mean, take last Christmas. Normally we expect hundreds of people to come in for the carol services and for the midnight mass. And how could we possibly do this in the church hall? Because if we didn't use the church, there'd be a riot. So thanks to modern technology, we were able to have a TV link-up between the south aisle of the church and the church hall, and this did the trick. And it was very effective too. And I think that one of the great things about all this has been, yes, it was a disaster, but it hasn't been a complete disaster, because it's had some marvellous side effects. I hope in these 2 or 3 nights that you've been watching that you found what I've said interesting. You might actually like to see where I got my information from. It's a little publication that we've brought out, and you might like to have a look at it yourself. But I still go back to the point I started on, that yes, I do feel a bit guilty of having been responsible for letting the place burn down, but I think there are 2 very good things that have come out of all this, which I think I'm very pleased about. Firstly, that because we had a fire, there'll be no more Death Watch Beetle in that church, and that's tremendous good news. And secondly, it'll be the smartest church for miles around, and that can't be bad. Well, I hope you've been interested in these talks on the fire and how it affected us, and I wish you a very good night. But I may just say that if ever you have any disaster in your own life, just remember that God sometimes brings the most marvellous byproducts and good effects out of it. Good night then. God bless you. Many of you will know that our church at Tamerton Foliot burned down about a year ago, exactly actually, the 18th of September 1981. And it meant quite a lot of work, but we actually reopened it this weekend. Now, I suppose that the last time that any church burned down in the Plymouth area must have been during the Blitz, and here we are commemorating Battle of Britain Sunday, when so many people used their skills and their bravery to save this country from disaster. And it's rather exciting to think that we're able to reopen this church, devastated by fire, about the same time. And looking back, I don't know how we ever got the thing into shape so quickly, except that it meant the skills and the time and the talents and imagination of so many people. And we worked as a team, and everybody who worked on that team did their work well, and they did it superbly. And I suppose that's really how the Battle of Britain was won, because it was teamwork. Well, it had its moments yesterday. Somebody came over from North Devon. I hadn't seen her for 27 years. Do you know, she was the matron of my school at Norwich, and she brought some photographs of all the old boys at the school, and we chatted. I remembered all their names. We had a super time together, and she went home today, and that was rather nice. I remember one of the things about her particularly, she didn't know I'm going to tell you this, that I was singing the grace once before a meal, and I got as far as saying, "For what we're about to receive," and everything went blank. And so I tried again. I said, "For what we're about to receive," and she got so frustrated at that she said, "Oh, come on, boys," and they all stood lined up and got their meal. Stood there looking like a twerp. Anyway, It was a great day yesterday, and one of the highlights was the releasing of a couple of hundred balloons from the church tower to mark the end of the festivities, and that was great. And if you find one of the labels in your backyard or on your lawn tomorrow morning or during the week, please do send it back to me, because it's all part of a competition. And having to use the church hall next door as a church for the past year meant that we all got very rusty, and we were forgetting where things were. For instance, this morning at the communion service, I forgot my stole, and I forgot my safe keys. And if that wasn't bad enough, when I got to evensong tonight and got up to the pulpit to preach the sermon, I suddenly discovered I'd left my sermon notes at home, and that was hopeless. I just had to preach off the cuff. Don't let anybody know. And of course, nobody wanted to walk on the new carpet, which is beautifully laid down the aisle. Lovely red carpet. And I thought that perhaps it might be a good idea if I took my shoes off and set the lead, but of course anybody who knows my feet know they reek to high heaven, and didn't think it was a very good idea. Anyway, the best of all, I think, is the floodlighting of the tower. That's lovely. And I think that if you're able to have a look at that, you'll agree with me, it's one of the most superb things about the restoration of the church, and it's some little touch that we've added. And I think what it says to me is that although everything isn't quite as I want it, isn't that like life itself, that there are many things that you can improve and many things that you want to do, but you don't always get the opportunity to do them at the same time. So it's been a long day, and it's been a long year, and in many respects, I suppose it had to be like that. But if you're ever in our area, please do come and worship God with us. And if nothing else, I hope that it will restore your faith in the fact that there are still people about today who care about doing things and doing them well. So good night, and God bless you. I cleared the leat. That's a ditch running across my garden. Chock-a-block with nettles and brambles and goodness knows what else. So I've learned that if I don't want to be stung to death by wasps, or eaten up by horseflies, or driven crazy by insects, the only thing to do really is to dress up for the occasion properly. So I found a large straw hat, which I got from a jumble sale, and fixed yards of net curtain on it, as I look more like a bride at a wedding than anything else. And I tucked it all into my shirt, and I rolled my sleeves down, put on my welly boots, and my oldest gardening trousers and gloves. And with all this on, and a sweatband around my forehead because it's such hot weather, then I was all ready for the work. And of course, anybody coming across me, not expecting to see me, would probably have a heart attack. One would wonder whether it was an attack from space. But I don't care, because all I know is that it worked. So I got the tools together, and I set about clearing the leat, dressed in this strange garb. Now what made it difficult was that amongst all those nettles and brambles and such like, and the undergrowth, were some felled trees and their branches, and I'd forgotten about this occasionally, and of course you've guessed, yes, I tripped over these and fell headlong into the ditch, and there's nothing quite so undignified as being helpless, upside down among the nettles, and among the brambles, and the mud and all that, looking like nothing on earth as well. However, my gear was superb in keeping the insects at bay, but gradually, I sort of had a feeling that there were rather more wasps buzzing around me than was healthy, and I was getting a bit worried about this, and only when I stopped and looked down to see what was what, did I notice that I was right on a wasp's nest. So clearing the leat had to be delayed for another day or two until I could get rid of the wasps. And when I started again, I found that I still couldn't clear the leat, because it would have meant destroying the biggest load of blackberries that I've ever come across. They were enormous, gorgeous things. I can't bear wasting anything like that. So it became a blackberrying holiday instead. And clearing the leat had to be delayed yet again, because I then had to do something with the blackberries. Of course, the best thing to do was to make homemade wine with them, which I then set about doing. More about that tomorrow. Now, on reflection, I realise that the more I looked, the more I began to see those blackberries, whereas the day before, a day or two before, in the very same part of the garden, when I'd only been looking for nettles and brambles, it was only nettles and brambles that I actually saw. Now, the point is this, that it's occurred to me since then that this is just how we do or don't think about God and his goodness. That we look for the bad things of life, and that's what we see. But when we stop taking God for granted, and when we start looking for his goodness, then goodness is just what we notice. Well, see you again tomorrow night, and meanwhile, good night, and God bless you. People these days seem to like making their own homemade wine, and it's a hobby of mine as well. Now, last week I made about 8 gallons of the stuff and bottled it up and put it all in fermenting jars and put it on a table and felt jolly pleased with the day's work. Now, unfortunately, when I woke up the next morning, there was absolute chaos. The stuff had fermented all out of the airlocks and down the bottles,